Hi, I'm Dr. Randy Bach. Today is March 23rd, and I'm honored to have with us Thomas Fazi. Thomas, tell us a little about yourself. What's been your journey? What's new?
Hi, Randall. Thanks a lot for having me on your show. It's a pleasure to be here. I guess I describe myself as a journalist and a writer, as in someone who writes books and not just articles. I've been doing this for more than 10 years now. I started out I had a stint in documentary filmmaking when I was younger, and then I got into written journalism, and I've been doing that for quite some time now. And before the pandemic, my areas of focus / expertise were economics and European integration mainly. So that's what I mainly wrote about from a kind of a heterodox, critical perspective on both issues. Since the pandemic, I've of course, like a lot of people, been devoting a lot of time to writing about, public health, or better, the public health disaster that the pandemic has been. And I came across a wonderful book in early 2022, which was called A COVID Consensus, which had been written by this British historian called Toby Green. And it was the first book that really took a critical look at lockdowns, and it was an eye-opener for me. I mean, I had already developed my own ideas about lockdown, and in fact, I'd already participated in anti-lockdown demonstrations here in Italy. Oh, by the way, I live in Rome, in Italy. But this was the first, kind of solid, theoretical work that I had come across that approached lockdowns from a critical perspective, and especially looked at the impact of lockdowns in the global south and the developing world, which is a perspective that I had not come across at all, not even in kind of critical circles, skeptic circles. And so I got in touch with Toby, and we developed initially a friendship, an intellectual friendship, and also, almost a relationship of mutual moral support, as two people that come from the left and were deeply estranged with the left's reaction to COVID, and so we started just discussing these ideas, and talking about why the left had taken such absurd stances on issues such as lockdowns and then vaccine mandates and so on. And we started writing together about the pandemic on Unheard, which is a British online magazine, from an explicitly left-wing perspective. I think that's what maybe kind of made our analyses maybe slightly different from the kind of critical analyses that were already out there, which were mainly coming from the right. Now, there's probably a lot to say about whether these terms even mean anything anymore. We might, get into that in a moment. But just to make sense, for simplification, we were explicit about the fact that our analysis came from the left, and in fact, the first article we wrote together was called "The Left's COVID Failure," and where we criticized the left's response to COVID. And the response was really interesting, because I think that's a single article for which I've received the biggest feedback ever. I mean, I'm not exaggerating when I say that I received hundreds of emails from people, from self-described leftists, just thanking us for writing the piece, because the tone of most emails was, I thought I was crazy for thinking these things as someone on the left, and thank you so much for giving voice to what I've been thinking, for many months now. So I'm not crazy after all. There are other people out there that come from the left, but nonetheless are very critical of these policies, because of course there was very little of that on social media, let alone on mainstream liberal / progressive publications, which were all staunchly, with hardly any exception, pro COVID consensus, basically. And so after that, we started writing other pieces, looking at various aspects of the pandemic response. And when the time came for Toby to write the second edition of his book, the updated edition, he asked me if I wanted to write it with him. He said, it just seemed natural for us to write it together, because we're already writing about the pandemic on a regular basis, so we might as well just write the updated version of his book together, and that's what we did, and that's how the second edition of the COVID consensus came about, which came out only basically just over a month ago, which is in fact a completely new book, because the first edition came out, it was written right in the middle of the second lockdown, so late 2020, and so it was so much of what a lot of things still hadn't happened yet, especially in relation to the vaccines and so on. And so in this second edition, we really try to offer what we think is maybe a bit arrogantly the most comprehensive look at the critical analysis of the pandemic that's been written yet. And in fact, that's what motivated us to write the book in the first place. Of course, we were aware that a number of books had already been written about the pandemic, but our feeling was that most books focused on individual aspects. They were criticizing the individual aspects of the pandemic rather of the pandemic, or better, of the pandemic response, whether it be lockdowns or the vaccines or the World Health Organization. But we felt that, there wasn't an analysis out there that tied all these strands together into a coherent kind of, holistic analysis of the pandemic, which we felt very necessary, because we felt that these were all different aspects of the same story. It was, as we try to show in the book, you can't understand lockdowns without understanding, the vaccine push, and you can't understand the vaccine push without understanding, lockdowns. I mean, all these various elements of the pandemic response, of the COVID consensus, are tied together. And so this is what we try to do in the book, and I think we came close to what our objective was. And I'm very, very happy and very, very proud of it. And of course, compared to the first edition, there's also much more in-depth political reflection on what the pandemic has meant. I mean, the first edition was written right in the midst of it. The second edition was written kind of as the emergency was receding, and so we were also able to take sort of a more wide-eyed look at what had happened. And of course, a lot of things are still ongoing, but enough had happened, for us to be able to take stock of what of kind of what had gone on, the madness of the previous 3 years, and so we offer also kind of our interpretation of what that has meant politically and economically and so on.
That's excellent, thank you. So let me ask you, when you say COVID consensus, I mean, consensus means people thinking, coming to a conclusion, I suppose, of sorts. Have we, and what is that consensus? Or is it more of a critical concept of what had been the various consensi through time?
Right. Now, well, when we speak of the COVID consensus, we mean a kind of enforced consensus that was rammed down people's throats, and that was presented across the, by government and public health officials and through the mainstream media. So, it's what we refer to as this kind of single narrative relating to, to what was going on, which was the only thing you could hear wherever you turned, pretty much wherever you turned. So this is what we mean with, the COVID consensus. It was this elite level consensus that was then kind of, very aggressively imposed on everyone else. And we think it's important to focus on this consensus, because it's a fundamental element, I think, and it's very helpful in understanding really what happened, because we take a kind of a global look at especially the kind of really early weeks of the pandemic, and it's quite extraordinary to see how this consensus it solidifies, it crystallizes very, very early on in terms of what's going on and what the necessary response must be. I.e., we're facing an incredibly deadly virus that represents a threat that's bearing down on humanity as a whole. It's an invisible enemy that threatens anyone, anywhere. And the only possible way to avoid an incalculably high number of deaths is to adopt this completely novel response, which is lockdowns, which we will need to adopt until a vaccine is ready, at which point we will need to vaccinate as many people as possible, ideally the entire world, at which point we might be able to return to normal. This is the condensed version of the COVID consensus, and it emerges very, very early on across the planet, really. And I think that's another really interesting aspect of what happened. I mean, it's the first time that billions of people across hundreds of nations are exposed to an almost identical narrative concerning what, in effect, is also the first ever global state of emergency. Never before had a state of emergency been declared at a global level. Yes, we've had pandemics, been declared before, but hardly anyone remembers even the last pandemic before COVID, which was the 2009 swine flu pandemic, which hardly anyone even remembers about. So this is the first time that we see this kind of global, the imposition of this global state of emergency, and the parallel rise of this single narrative at a global, harmonized at a global level, which we call the COVID consensus. And of course, it's consensus that has nothing to do with scientific evidence, with the science, with what the science was saying, with what the evidence was saying. With it is also a consensus that's completely at odds, radically at odds with what the actual scientific consensus as to how you manage pandemics, and especially respiratory influenza pandemics, pre-2020. It's a radical reversal of what the actual scientific consensus had been on pretty much any issue. Any issue you take, whether it's universal masking or natural immunity, or population-wise. Wide quarantines. I mean, the consensus was all against these measures right up to 2020, and suddenly we see a radical inversion of the consensus. But it was a politically constructed consensus, which had.
I agree with you there. So a couple of things come to mind. First of all, there's a bad joke. I'm the son of a lawyer. My brother's a lawyer. I love lawyers, but there's a joke. How do you keep a lawyer from drowning? And the answer is you take your foot off his neck. Because I mean, the jokes, I think it's funny, and it's funny because we have kind of a contempt for lawyers. Yeah. But it seems to me that the COVID consensus is, in a sense, the acting out of that joke. How do you keep the populace from? How can you make the populace healthy again? Well, you take your foot off their neck. It seems like the COVID consensus, as you phrase it, was putting their foot on our necks for some greater good. And the question is, what is that greater good? I'm going to bundle in a couple things to this question. I apologize.
I would put that in quotes.
Fair enough. And there's 2004 Dr. Fauci, who was on C-SPAN announcing, and I do my Fauci voice, so I apologize, but there's basically nothing like having the natural case. He's talking about influenza. If you've had the flu, there's no reason to get a flu shot later. This is just superfluous, whatever. And your natural immunity is always going to be more complete than a vaccine immunity, which is only one, whatever.
That's uncanny.
He was quoted on that, and if you post that video today, on literally today or yesterday, on Facebook, you get blacked out. I had a friend who did it, and it's been going around, making the rounds, and that gets blotted out, and it gets a disclaimer. You can't even see the video. You only can see the fact checker version of it. So this was always the consensus. I'm going to just put a little kind of thought bubble here. There was, I think, a 2019 kind of war games, Gates Foundation or something like that, about locking down the populace. And then the last part of my embedded question is I searched Google Scholar for lockdowns, but I put a time filter on, like 2017 or something like that. So you see when lockdowns had been applied in public health, there are two instances, apparently, in the modern era, at least in the 21st century. One was Sierra Leone for Ebola. and the other was in South Africa, which was already a kind of a prison hospital, or like a not quite a leper ward, but a severe TB, resistant TB ward. So they locked that down. It was not really, so lockdown has always been a prison term, and all the other usage of that term in the public health canon is for prisons. How did we get from prisons? So getting back to my joke, how do you keep a lawyer from drowning? You take your foot off his neck. Well, we see that with George Floyd as an analogy, and so but that's a prisoner concept. That's a one that has huge disdain, and people went nuts when the guy's foot was on George Floyd's neck. Were we George Floyd, and shouldn't we be? There's another joke. The guy goes to the king. It's like the people are revolting. It's like, I know they should shower, but anyway. So I don't know if you sense a question in there, but I guess the question is what brings on this concept where there's such kind of animosity to the subject, and to what greater good or end was it? And as a conspiracy kind of theory, was it for a vaccine, or was it for some political end, or was it from some reordering, reshuffling of the social order? How big a thing was it? Was it genuinely public health? Was it health at all?
Right. A lot of questions in there. So kind of unpacking them one at a time. On the issue of lockdowns, lockdowns, the lockdown as what the term has come to mean during the COVID pandemic, that concept, it didn't exist. So, not only had lockdowns really, as in nationwide lockdowns, not only had they never been really implemented before, they'd never even been conceived of before. So if you look at all the pre-2020 pandemic plans drawn out by governments and even by the WHO itself, the word lockdown doesn't appear once. But not only does the word not appear, the concept doesn't appear in other other words either. The concept is just not there. And in fact, the WHO's report on the management of epidemics and pandemics, which came out, interestingly, in late 2019, just a few months before the outbreak, the official outbreak in Wuhan, explicitly states or counsels against the quarantine, even of exposed individuals. So even of individuals that had come into contact with a positive person, even the quarantine of these exposed individuals is said is not recommended because the report says, and I quote, "There is no obvious rationale for it," and the report also notes, rightfully so, that there are also ethical implications in locking people up, people that haven't actually broken a law. This is all discussed. This was all fairly well understood pre-2020. So we've gone from a consensus where the WHO itself recommended against the quarantining even of exposed individuals to the quarantining of the entire population, including, of course, an overwhelming majority of healthy people. This is something that had never been attempted before. You mentioned Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone is one of the few places where a 72-hour lockdown was attempted in 2014 against Ebola. And interestingly, the consensus was that the experiment had been a complete disaster. And in fact, Médecins Sans Frontières, Medicines Without Borders, that kind of oversaw the implementation of that measure and was there when it happened, issued a very scathing critique of that 72-hour lockdown, saying that it didn't work. And in fact, it might have actually made things worse because, of course, you're locking people up in the same household, and obvious reasons why lockdowns might actually make things worse. And we can go into that if we want. But the consensus was that what did not exist as to lockdowns. Also, you mentioned I didn't know this interview by Fauci that you mentioned, but in the book we do speak about talking of Ebola. In 2014, when some American nurses were coming back from Africa, re-entering America, there was kind of a small debate in America as to whether these nurses that had come into contact with people suffering from Ebola, and Ebola is one of the most, one of the deadliest diseases in the world, with a shockingly high infection fatality rate, nothing to do with COVID. That's a truly terrifying virus. And there was a debate as to whether these people should be put in quarantine when they arrived into, I think it was Newark Airport. And in fact, Fauci came out against the quarantine measure, actually calling it a bit draconian. So if in 2014, Fauci considered the quarantine, a week-long quarantine or whatever for a few people coming back from Africa who had come into contact with the most, the deadliest disease, one of the deadliest diseases in the world, too draconian. And this is the same person that a few years on would then go to, lock us all up inside our houses, and accuse anyone who didn't agree of being a right-wing, not a fascist, and so on. So, I mean, so we have to ask ourselves, what happened in that interval. I mean, it's not like any new science, any new pro-lockdown science emerged. I mean, it's not like new evidence emerged and so we changed our opinion over lockdowns. Of course, nothing of the sort happened. And this is one of the most incredible aspects of what happened in those early weeks. We went from Western commentators, even public health officials, looking at what was happening in Wuhan with a mixture of shock and even a bit of horror. I mean, if you go back to those early articles, even in the in the progressive press, in the Guardian, and so on, they described what was happening in Wuhan in with varying degrees of skepticism, if not outright concern. Articles published about how they were welding people inside their homes and how drones were following people around, and it was all described as pretty Orwellian. And there was this understanding that right or wrong, those measures never would have been able to be applied in the so-called liberal democratic West. And over the course of literally just a few weeks, we see a complete overturning, and we see the consolidation of this pro-lockdown consensus. So this measure that had never been tried, never been conceived of, those few occasions where it had been tested, it had considered to have been a complete disaster, suddenly becomes, in the words of the WHO's first mission finding report to China, which comes out in late February, becomes the only possible response to what was then just an epidemic, because the pandemic hadn't been declared yet. And this is shocking on the basis of no evidence whatsoever, except the fact that it seemed like cases were going down in China. But, and that, of course, raises a whole number of issues, like how much can you trust, the data that's being provided by the Chinese authorities, and apart from that, but we already see the emergence of this idea that it's all about flattening the curve. Anything goes, anything is justified in the name of keeping down and reducing COVID hospitalizations and COVID deaths. As if that's the only cause of death and the only cause of hospitalization to be concerned of. And in the name of reducing or flattening that curve, or reducing or slowing down that curve, anything is justified. And anything, and whatever we do, that'll be a humane response, because we're only doing it to save lives. So a completely extraordinary U-turn in terms of public health response. And what drove it? I mean, of course, that's $1 million question, and we try to I think we provide I think, first of all, just by kind of describing the events in detail, I mean, I think that's what we do in the first part of the book, is just really offer a chronological, description of what happened. And I think just when you see what happened, and you put, you connect, and you start connecting the dots. I mean, there's very little of our own opinion in that first. In the second part of the book, it's very much our own analysis of what happened. But in the first part of the book, it's very much quite a dry kind of, just like, this is literally what happened. Also going back to before the pandemic. And so we, of course, mentioned that, there had been a pandemic preparedness industry that had been burgeoning in the years preceding the pandemic. We don't go too much into that. I would like to have gone more into that in a book. It's something that I've developed in articles that have come out after the book's publication. But in fact, I mean, even going back to the early 2000s, we see the emergence of kind of health security and biosecurity as a new paradigm. On the one hand, with the collapse of, I mean, ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union, of course, it's all been about identifying new threats. And at some point, this consensus forms as to the fact that, the future threats will be bio threats. And that could mean, man-made threats, so terrorist threats and bioterrorism, or it could be natural threats, and
or could theoretically be political threats. So I just had a couple thoughts as you were going. First of all, you mentioned quarantine quite a bit, and you're in Italy, and quarantine is an Italian word for 40, number 40, quarante, and the concept was, I think, from the Black Death, the plague, to keep people inside for 40 days until they could prove themselves healthy. But that was for people who actually had active cases, not for people who had, healthy and so forth. And so this is inimical to the concept of quarantine in a sense, lockdown. But keeping healthy people at bay from each other. We talked a little bit about Ebola and kind of the organism of Ebola. It meets essentially the organism of the populace. And so, early Dr. Fauci, there's early Fauci, there's current Fauci. I call current Fauci kind of the Fauci bot. And I use that as a pun because the BOT is a bot, and he has all these kind of pre-programmed answers for things, but he's also maybe Fauci bought, B-O-U-G-H-T, purchased. And I'm not sure exactly what it was. I think there's two different levels of Fauci bought, purchased. And I think at the time, in the U.S. at the very least, there was a common enemy between China and the U.S. So this is my conspiracy theory. And mind you, the word conspiracy means to breathe together. So it's a little bit ironic use in terms of a pandemic. So that's the conspiracy. And so we were all theoretically breathing together, but the conspiracy was to keep people away from breathing together. So my kind of, this is, I haven't written this up, and I'm not sure it's right or wrong, but I feel as if the actual antiviral response, the true antibody response, was to excise the foreign body, which was Mr. Trump in the White House, and it was quasi coordinated. I don't think conspiracy. I'm not sure every step along the way. I'm not sure the virus knew or if it leaked out. I don't think people. But as things kind of moved along, I think it became a very convenient vehicle, of kind of change analogy, like a Trojan horse. To destroy the good economy, kind of his ratings in the polls, and to give him a huge challenge and to throw things in his way. And lockdowns were basically, it almost immediately turned into a means to change the absentee ballot process we had already had in the U.S. To this kind of mass, dissemination of ballots, which could be ripe for harvesting, and as it turns out, were. I don't necessarily think there was election fraud on the day of the election per se, but I think there was clearly a change in the way voting occurred and the way they could be literally, or figuratively harvested. Anyway, so the question I have, I guess, is was there some kind of political? I mean, do you wind up uncovering some kind of political underpinnings of this? Do you ascribe? And I know that this happened throughout the West, but at least I think. I'm not sure where lockdowns happened first. Maybe you could elucidate that. I think there might have been in Bergamo, whatever, but I don't think they were nationwide as where it was applied in the U.S. at the time, when really it was only happening in Queens, maybe Washington State, a couple places, but not in Omaha, not in Chicago, not in Texas, and so forth. And we had a universal nationwide lockdown. Anyway, so maybe. Do you find a question there? You want to unpack that?
No, I mean, the question's clear. I mean, again, we return to the question of, what was the motive? And I think it's pretty clear that there were, we make a clear distinction in the book between a, conspiracy and you mentioned coordination. I think they're two very different things. I mean, conspiracy implies secrecy, but a lot of what happened has been, a lot of the decisions were openly, a lot of the actors that played a crucial role in the pandemic response had been very open about, their preference for this kind of response. And so, again, I mentioned earlier, the threat of this the rise of the new bio threat and how this starts to, leads to, to the creation of this kind of pandemic preparedness industry, beginning in the early 2000s. And it also, and this includes theorizing that health crises could be a very convenient way to, limit civil liberties, impose, draconian control over the population, sweep aside, constitutional guarantees, and so on and so forth. I mean, this is openly discussed in a number of these so-called simulations. I mean, there's a Rockefeller Institute document that's simulation that came out in 2010, and it looks at various scenarios, and one of these scenarios involves a pandemic which leads to China adopting a draconian response, which is then copied throughout the West, leading to a structural transformation of Western societies into more controlled, more authoritarian societies. I mean, it's openly it's an uncanny description of what actually happened 10 years later. And of course, that could just be a coincidence. But I think it points to the fact that, regardless of what we consider to be the virus's origin, and whether it was, deliberately put out there or not, I mean, there's no evidence of that. I mean, I think there's a strong evidence for the fact that the virus is likely to have come from the Wuhan lab, but there's no evidence that that was deliberately put out there. I think what's clear is that there was a kind of a biosecurity complex which was already ready to respond to an event like this in the way that they responded. So a very, and this is a confluence of interests. It comprises some of the biggest biotech and pharma companies in the world. It comprises, the world's most powerful public health institutions at the national and international level. Of course, the WHO first and foremost. It includes the intelligence and the security apparatuses within the states, the so-called, deep state. And so on and so forth, and they had kind of coalesced at a global level in the years preceding the pandemic. And so, the response that we saw was a response that was driven. It wasn't driven by, it wasn't driven by national politics. It wasn't driven by elected governments. It was driven by very opaque centers of power, which stood to benefit from the response that we saw. And so, what are the two most powerful fractions of capital in the world today? It's the IT industry, big tech, and pharmaceutical industry. I mean, even before the pandemic, these were the most highly capitalized companies in the world, i.e. the most powerful companies in the world. And, it just so happens that these are the two sectors that most benefited from the pandemic response. Essentially, the IT sector from the lockdowns, which amounted to a massive transfer of wealth from, the real economy to these, internet oligopolies, destruction of the real economy, destruction of small and medium businesses, at the advantage of these, mega corporations, as a result of the fact that we all, life just turned online all of a sudden. And then you have in the second phase of the pandemic, of course, the vaccine rollout, which obviously, caused some of what were already some of the richest corporations on the planet to make the biggest profits that have ever been seen in such a short period of time. I mean, I don't think a company had registered $100 billion in profit just for Pfizer. I think just in 2022, we're talking astonishing amounts of money, and of course, it's not just money for itself; it's money as a vehicle for power, as a vehicle for control. And so, in terms of why, and I think the profit element is fundamental. I think part of the problem is the fact that our institutions have been completely captured by private interests, by vested interests, and these are the ones that largely drove the pandemic response. I mean, their control over the public health industry, apparatus is total. I mean, if you consider the Gates essentially has more influence and power over the WHO than virtually any state on the planet, just by virtue of the money he puts into the WHO. He's the second biggest funder, and largely decides how much of the money, how much of the funds is spent. I mean, this show, and we also know that Gates was, of course, very well connected to the very well invested in the pharmaceutical industry. And so, you don't need to be particularly conspiratorial to see. I mean, you need just a very, standard, materially based analysis to understand that, in the pandemic, as throughout any other, as in any other crisis, those in power will try to benefit from the crisis. And in fact, this used to be a pretty well understood concept on the left. I'm thinking of authors like Naomi Klein, that she wrote a book called The Shock Doctrine, which is all about how capitalism exploits crises to its own advantage. She looks at Katrina and and natural emergencies and so on, where each crisis is exploited by big corporations, and
sometimes they're actually annealed. They're kind of glued, welded together. Getting back to Dr. Fauci, for my book, we'll maybe get to later, Overturning Zika, I did a fair amount of research on that, and Dr. Fauci comes up as well as WHO, a lot of the same actors and so forth. And there's part of the narrative which it kind of glues onto a few other aspects. I'll just give one, which was kind of this climate narrative, which in a sense is also, according to Naomi, theory that, kind of basically, I guess it's a Linsky concept, never let a crisis go to waste. And so the Zika one is saying, oh, well, this is part of global, warming, climate change, because these tropical things are going to take over the world. So it didn't really happen, and it hasn't happened since then, but it's part of the still narrative that goes on. So we have to do things kind of on a literally global sense, and we have to do all, but all these things wind up being a centralization of power. We're going to tell you, how much to drive. There's the 15-minute city. We're going to tell you how much to drive, whether you can drive, whether you should drive. We're going to do all that stuff. And who are we? Well, we're the guys that don't really get affected by our proclamations. And so, you've written on a large variety of topics, and we're not going to be able to cover even probably a tenth of them today. But a lot of them, I think, have to do with a sense that the kind of the genuine, say, I'm not a socialist, but the genuine, purest motivations of socialism, which is caring for those less fortunate. And I think this has been lost in the debate. So the question I have for you is how did you mentioned draconian a fair number of times, and Draco is actually a character in Harry Potter, and he winds up in Slytherin, House of Slytherin. So Harry Potter has a sorting hat, which decides whether you're going to go to I forget, it's Huff and Puff, Slytherin, or the one that Harry Potter goes to.
Gryffindor.
Yeah, there you go. Anyway, so what was the sorting hat that took the left away from caring about those things and made it into draconian, into Slytherin? So I feel that this is a complicity, and it winds up not being left in the sense that we care about our poor people. It winds up being left as like, how can we get the bigger power? And I'm going to put one other tidbit into the question, which is there's a test for maturity. They give kids, a bunch of kids, they put in a room, they put marshmallows in front of them. And they say, if you eat a marshmallow, you can have the marshmallow. If you don't eat the marshmallow, you can have 20 marshmallows tomorrow. And the less mature ones eat the marshmallows. So, and as kids get older, they do this experiment of 5, 10, 15, whatever. They're 15 years, none of them eat the marshmallows. They understand the future. So is this part of the greater good, that the greater goal is to kind of take over society from the left, and we're going to do all this stuff now because we can accumulate, agglomerate, and congeal power? So that's a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is. What we witnessed was, so I think there were profit motives, but there were also political motives. Maybe other centers of power had more political motives. I mean, I think there were, elements in Western power that definitely were worried that they were losing control. I mean, let's not forget that the late 2010s are the years of the so-called populist moment throughout the West. You've got Brexit, Trump. I mean, there was this kind of democratic uprising in a number of anti-elite, anti-establishment uprising in a number of countries. So I think the elites were kind of freaking out, and Trump is obviously the most, is clearly at the center of all this. So I don't think it's completely unreasonable to think that the pandemic was also a way to put an end, a way to put an end to all this, and it worked. In fact, I mean, we've seen the so-called populists, everywhere, have been, largely wiped out by the pandemic. First and foremost, Trump. So I think there's an argument to be made there, that maybe Trump in particular, and more in general, the kind of this democratic populist uprising that we saw in those years was one of the targets of this measure, as a way to roll back democracy and roll back any challenge to the status quo. And I think I think the left, the contemporary left, it shares this anti-democratic project. I think that the contemporary left has a deep distrust for the masses, for the people. There's a class element there too. A lot of those on the mainstream left, especially in academia, so the ones that are kind of crafting the left-wing narrative. And of course, there are a number of. I think it's always important to distinguish when we talk about the left. I mean, we're not. As the response to my article showed, a lot of ordinary people that identified as being on the left didn't necessarily share that worldview. We're talking about the kind of elite left that shapes what comes across as what the left thinks, and so the left in academia, the left in and the left in the media, especially. I mean, we're talking. These are all members of the so-called laptop class. They're people whose jobs aren't rooted in production anymore. They have no contact with that world anymore. They have really not that much of a contact with the actual working class anymore. In fact, they largely despise the working classes because the working classes' values tend to be so different from theirs. The working classes, they don't buy into woke progressivism, and so any attachment that ordinary people have to traditions, to social cohesion, and the existence of borders and the need for borders and so on is seen by those on the left as proof of the intrinsic kind of reactionary nature and fascist nature of the masses. And so there's a deep distrust and deep fear, I would say, of the masses, which I just considered to be a bunch of racist, fascist, ignorant nuts. And so there is this idea that and so the left has largely given up on democracy. They know that they will never be able to achieve their vision of society by via democratic means, because they never do, because their worldview is so unpopular, and so they've realized that they can actually even though they represent a very small minority view in society, by exercising control over the means of the production of knowledge and the production of information, they can actually, impose their worldview on the rest of society. And we see that in a number of realms. And I think a lot of them did see the pandemic, in this way. For them, it was so. A lot of them might have actually, they're delusional, but they don't all acting in bad faith. I think, there's a good part of them that are they really did believe that finally now we're going to see, the collective being prioritized rather than the individual, which is what, from their perspective, we've seen in the neoliberal era. Finally, the return of public health, the return of the state, after years of pro market and pro free market narratives and so on and so forth. So that's how they viewed this, as a way of, they really saw this as I think there was it Jane Fonda, I think, in an interview, she described the pandemic as a gift from God to the left. That's how they viewed. That's how a lot of them viewed this. Finally, this is our chance, to implement all the things we believe in.
I'm going to stop you there for a second. I apologize, but we're rounding towards the end of our hour together, and I kind of I think there's an expression, I think from the left, the personal is political, and sometimes the other way around. The political becomes personal. I think that was my own experience. That I'm in a lot of different groups, and one of them is a sports club, and play tennis and so forth. A lot of guys, mostly guys, and everyone. I'm kind of more on the right, and they're almost uniformly on the left. Everyone gets along, but COVID became a huge kind of political schism, and people wound up yelling at each other, mostly yelling at me, frankly. But on a personal basis, I want to tell our audience. I mean, you've translated George Soros, Christopher Hitchens, Robert Reich. I don't know if you dealt with them personally at all. I'm a huge admirer. I believe he's a socialist also, Christopher Hitchens, for his huge, brilliant man. May he rest in peace, and so forth. Did you have personal encounters with them? And I'll just leave this one little thought bubble. In the libertarian world, the author of Black Swan, Nicholas Nassim Taleb, I think it is. He wound up, putting at least double masks on his airlines. He's been so COVID, paranoid and so forth. He lost a little bit of his cachet amongst the libertarian world for this kind of like anti-libertarian aspect, and people, I think, got kind of whirled around. I mean, our minds, we're preoccupied with fear. We're fearful of fear, and so the question is, was there any kind of reordering of your say pantheon of heroes? How did they act? How do they act? And did it change anything in your own personal life? As a man, a family man, a man of community.
Well, I mean, it's definitely it definitely was a final straw in my long progressive estrangement from the left, for sure. I mean, I'd already grown quite estranged from the mainstream left by adopting, for example, a very kind of pro-national sovereignty, a very pro-national sovereignty stance. I've always been very critical of the European Union and the euro, which I consider to be, a pro-corporate, anti-democratic project, which has nothing to do with the left. But most of the left is enamored with the European Union, and so that had, that kind of had already put me at odds with the left for quite some time. But of course, the pandemic kind of, I think it really freed me once and for all from, any sentimental attachment to these labels. I think I've really broken free. I mean, like, I really, I used to worry about, should I write for that paper? What are my left-wing friends going to think? Because that paper is considered right-wing, even though, they're the only ones that won't censor me. And every left-wing paper I've proposed this article to won't take it or whatever. I used to worry about this a lot. I mean, now I don't worry about it anymore. I mean, I realize that those labels are completely meaningless. In fact, I think, they've become a great instrument in the hands of the elites for control, for dividing and conquering societies, because people, they don't, so long as people will view and analyze and understand reality, not on the basis of what certain policies or certain people actually stand for, but in the way those policies, those people are described in the mainstream media, and view those things or those people through these prisms, I think it'll be very easy to keep controlling the population, because all you have to do is say, lockdowns are right wing because Trump is right wing and he's against lockdowns, so clearly lockdowns must be
I think you mean left
wing. I mean, sorry, because clearly, lockdowns must be left wing because Trump is right wing and he's against them. Right. And so I think, and this is an oversimplification, but this is how a lot of people really kind of approached the pandemic and understood the pandemic. Right. I think a lot of people on the left switched their minds off very early on when they saw people like Trump and Bolsonaro and Johnson being the only ones that were mildly criticizing lockdowns. They instantly decided that if these very bad people are criticizing lockdowns, clearly lockdowns must be a good thing. And so people now define themselves in kind of oppositional terms, and I think this is very problematic. So I think ideally, I think we should try to break out from these labels. I think they're not helpful at all. I mean, they don't even mean what they used to mean. Even just 20 or 30 years ago. I mean, the contemporary left has nothing to do with the kind of the historical left rooted in the kind of socialist and communist tradition. I mean, at least in my perspective, at least it's definitely not rooted in the working class tradition anymore. But even the contemporary right, arguably, is not what it used to be. And so I think, we really have to find, I think, a new way of understanding reality, and we need a new political compass that goes beyond these terms, in my opinion. But the pandemic has certainly helped me break free from these terms, and I still use them because we haven't invented new words for understanding the world, and so we keep returning, even in this conversation. How many times have the words left and right come up? So we still use those terms to understand reality because we haven't got anything better. But I think we have to, ideally, we need a new vocabulary to understand the world, because these terms aren't very helpful anymore. So for me, it's been, I've lost a lot of friends through the pandemic, mostly on the left, but I found a wonderful community of new friends from all walks of life, from all political, ideological, and cultural backgrounds, and it's been beautiful. And I think what distinguishes us, what unites us, is that we're actually judging these policies on the basis of of how they made us feel, almost on a spiritual level. I think at some point you have to realize that there's almost an anthropological distinction to be made here. I think at some point, it's not all about a rational critique of lockdowns. Of course, there are not, I've written a 500-page book, about why lockdowns were wrong, but I don't think a lot of people need a 500-page book to realize why lockdowns are wrong. I think a lot of us just had an instinctive reaction against lockdowns. I think it's not a coincidence that a lot of I found, as fellow, comrades in this, pandemic journey, a lot of Christians, a lot of people that have a spiritual worldview. I think that's not a coincidence. I think maybe they were more heightened to the fact that there was something deeply wrong, deeply inhuman, about these policies. And so it's what we've seen is the emergence of a new community, a political community, but it's also pre-political in the sense that this has been for a lot of us a pre-political, a pre-ideological reaction. It was just a kind of a gut feeling reaction that just told us, no, it's wrong to lock people inside their homes, to stop people from socializing. It's wrong to stop kids from socializing. It's wrong to want to inject anything that breathes with an experimental vaccine.
Yeah, no, absolutely. All along, from early on, I was, I'm into words. I do cryptic puzzles and whatnot. But the concept of socialism and then being antisocial.
Yeah.
And we're going to have social distancing and so forth, which is an oxymoron in a sense, because there's nothing social about this, and it's antisocial to begin with. So I feel as if this is all anti-socialism, and I'm going to leave aside the deep meanings of those words. But we are social beings. And clearly, the worst punishment you can have in prison, you're in prison to begin with. It's horrible, concrete walls and metal toilets and all that kind of stuff, and no privacy. And then the worst punishment you can have is solitary. And this is what we did to everybody. And then the residuum we've seen play out is, lost years of education, lost years of social ability. Get back to that word. We've seen, I think the QALY, the quality adjusted life years from the draconian measures far will exceed that from the virus itself. And I think there was ample evidence from the Diamond Princess, at the very least in January 2020, that this was not all that. Whatever it did or didn't come out from China, that was fine. But we had a massive experiment with 3,711 people on a boat that if you wanted to duplicate, would have cost you $100 billion or more to get people on. And yet it was done, and it was all early on. And I'm a Sherlock Holmes fan from childhood. And there's a story of the dog that didn't bark in the night. And the mystery is solved because the dog knew the perpetrator and didn't bark. And so for me, the dog didn't bark was everyone who didn't mention the Diamond Princess. And that's the dog didn't bark. Why didn't you mention the Diamond Princess all along? This is an experiment. This should have been like, the populace should have been assuaged. The essence of public health is, public is a political part, and health, so for that you care or you don't care. And so everybody, again, getting to Fauci bot versus Fauci bought, some aspect where this became, experiment for an mRNA, treatment modality, which I'm not against mRNA per se as a treatment modality, but I think it should have come in like everything else, gradually. And so to have this foist upon the public was a huge abrogation. And I think Anthony, I forget his name, but Bridgen, MP Bridgen in UK, is being lambasted for having made an equivalence between this and the Holocaust. And I'm Jewish, my family suffered broadly, and so forth. I understand what the Holocaust was, but this, this didn't have, this is not that type of Holocaust, but it is certainly an ignorant application of horrible measures for materialist, selfish purposes. Anyway, we're going to be, I'm going to let you have the last word. And while you do that, I'm going to put up some of your work. So maybe you can just give us some guiding thoughts.
Yeah. I don't know. Just like it, you want me to wrap up, basically?
Well, yeah, give us your final thoughts. I'm going to show, while you're doing that, I'm just going to
I completely agree with what you said. I mean, there's so much that points to the fact that this wasn't a, because I think that's the narrative that I think they're going to go for. They're going to admit that a lot of these policies, a lot of these measures had negative consequences, because it's going to be impossible to hide the evidence. But they're going to say, yes, but we were acting, on a whim. We were, going out on a limb. We were improvising because, we were in the midst of this unprecedented emergency, and so we were testing things out. And yes, we'll admit that some of those things turned out to be I think at some point they will easily admit that lockdowns were a mistake, but the point is they weren't a mistake. I mean, I think this is the fundamental point. You mentioned Diamond Princess, and that points to the fact that it's not, they weren't overwhelmed by the panic. The panic was engineered, and it was engineered at the highest level. So of course, some mid-level politicians, mid-level bureaucrats, mid-level public health officials, without a doubt, were overwhelmed. But at the highest level, someone was engineering the panic. This panic didn't just engineer itself. It was engineered, and it was engineered in the form of, for example, exaggerating the dangerousness of COVID. And this was done at the highest level. As you mentioned, very early on, we knew that the actual, even from the early data coming out from Wuhan, we knew that the overall infection fatality rate was likely to be very, very low, and that that COVID only represented a serious threat for elderly people and people with serious medical preconditions. The data coming out of Wuhan already showed us this. Very early on, we had in fact, a study by John Ioannidis, one of the world's foremost scientists, who he estimated an infection fatality rate of, I think, less than 0.1% for the overwhelming majority of the population. And in fact, these numbers have been confirmed by a recent study that Ioannidis did. Where he came to the conclusion that for anyone, and this is in 2020, so pre-vaccines, COVID was already had an infection fatality rate of about 0.1% for anyone under 16. Yep. And of course, this was known. Instead, we had the WHO go out there and say very early on that the mortality rate of COVID was 3.4%, which is
craziness.
That was an hour.
I'm going to have to stop you there because we're heading towards the hour. So I want people to go out and buy your book. They can follow you on Twitter. Oops, this is the wrong one. I apologize. So here's your Twitter feed. Battle for Europe, which is an excellent point, and I recommend people follow you. You're brilliant and comprehensive, as we've seen from some of the things I showed. And I try to end with a little commercial for myself, so I apologize. This is my book, Overturning Zika, the Pandemic That Never Was. Here's the cover of the book. You can buy it on Amazon. It's coming out in Brazil very shortly. It's being published, and I'm hoping it's getting an audience there. Zika, the Pandemic That Never Was. Here's my self-portrait of me in the morning. we're going to leave it there. So thank you so much, Thomas. You're welcome to stay
Randall.
on briefly to chat with me, but everyone else, we're going to have to say goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.